and welcome to IDFC FIRST Bank presents Leaders of Tomorrow Season 11. This is India's longest running show for small businesses. I'm Sunanda Jayaseelan. You're watching this very special conversation where we're talking about Springboard events that propel India's small businesses into the next league of growth. Today, we're joining you from no other place than New Delhi, talking really with some of India's most eminent minds. To kickstart today's conversation in this episode, we have with us the head of startup banking at IDFC FIRST Bank, setting the context for India's small businesses. Also, we're hearing from our chief guest, India's G20 Sherpa, none other than Amitabh Kant.
Over the years, we have travelled to different Indian cities and hosted leadership conclaves aimed at seizing opportunities for our economy's growth engines, our SME and MSME sectors. Leaders of Tomorrow has been championing the cause of the springboards of the economy, our entrepreneurs, for a decade now. The growth landscape is set, with a launchpad to revamp ideas. Springboard to rebound missions, a podium to shape ambitions, and a promise to fulfill. The time for a thought leadership conclave is now. The time for fostering inclusive dialogue and ideas is now. Now, all that's left for us is to capitalize on India's Amrit Kaal. With a stellar lineup featuring India's biggest and brightest minds, economists, policy makers and entrepreneurs will all assemble on one platform. ET Now's Leaders of Tomorrow proudly presents Springboard.
Good evening, everyone. Before I begin to start telling our story, right, I thought since this is the Amrit Kaal that we're talking about, so let's understand. Let's put the story in context to begin with, right? Let's understand what is this Amrit Kaal that we're talking about, the 75th year of independence, right? And how are we placed? What do the macroeconomics look like, right? What is the environment looking like? All right. We have seen January being our second highest month of GST collections, right? Essentially showing the robustness of economy. This is the second largest, 1,55,000 crores, if I remember the number right. Our second best, because the highest was about 1,60,000 crores sometimes in April last year, right? This shows the robustness of economy. This shows the resilience of the economy, how we have bounced back from COVID now, right? Exports are showing a healthy trend, right? This coupled with significant capital outlay that we've seen towards capex investments, both from government, now from private sector, right? And the banks that we're talking about today, right, sitting on a good amount of liquidity, good amount of capital, also a clean balance sheet. So banks can also fund the growth today with a cleaner balance sheet that we're talking about. The numbers, I'm not getting into the numbers, all of you can see the numbers. The story is today we have all the nuts and bolts in place for a sustained, consistent growth for next few years, maybe next few decades to begin with, right? But that's what we're talking about. That's the macro environment looks like today. Where does IDFC Bank stand here today? What are we doing here in this environment? Okay. We are partnering with government to power digital commerce. We're partnering with RBI to power essentially digital currency. And we are partnering with ecosystem partners to encourage innovation, right? And we just, to give you an idea, we're just a 4-year-old bank in that sense. The merger of IDFC Bank and First Capital just happened about 4 years back. And all of these we're doing by putting customer first. I'm sure all of you are aware as to how we treat our customers. We recently announced some charge waiver in 2022 banking charges. We understand that transparency, trust and transparency matters the most when it comes to banking, right? We looked at some of these charges that the banks charge, which generally go unnoticed by most customers. Most customers don't even understand some of these charges, but they get debited, they get charged for these. We looked at some of these charges and said, we would waive all of these. If our customers don't understand, we don't charge them here. So the point I'm making is we are doing all of that I spoke about without compromising customer first philosophy that we have. And at the same time, we are also adding value to all our stakeholders, right? Look at the kind of financial numbers that we are reported, right? So all of that we're doing without compromising the basic principles of economy, that we add value, right? We add value here. And how do we do all of these? How do we do all of these that I've spoken about? As I told you, the bank is only about 4 years old. When it comes to merger, obviously IDFC Bank has its own story, right? Being an infrastructure institution. And First Capital its own story, being a consumption finance institution, right? They both come together and they created a bank which essentially is a challenger bank, which challenges the status quo. And let me give you a few examples of how we challenge the status quo. For a very, very long time in the banking industry, right, banks continue to pay interest on a quarterly basis on their savings account. It's a very simple thing to look at, right? But when we looked at it, we looked at it from a different lens. We are, as I told you, a consumption finance bank. We are an EMI bank. So we understand that every contribution to a household in their monthly budget makes a difference, even if it's a small interest payment on their bank account savings. Another problem, now I give you an example of on the personal side, individual side. Let me give you another example on the business side, right? And all of the entrepreneurs sitting here from the business side here, we all know that large corporates have efficient treasuries. They can afford to hire good treasury managers who ensure that every penny that they have in their bank account works for them, right? We know smaller businesses, emerging businesses, right, may not have the luxury of being able to hire professionals who can manage their treasuries very efficiently, which means a lot of their money is not working for them. But that's not something that we want to do. We wanted to change the space. What we did is we created essentially a product which enables small businesses to sweep in their money into a fixed deposit account and sweep back whenever they need it for payment, right? This, in a way, so what it means is your idle money in your current account starts earning interest, right? Which we haven't seen any bank doing, or even if some of the banks do, they keep this product in a drawer and not in their bag as they go and meet the customers, right? So which is what we look at. We look at some of these problems and we see how to address those problems, right? I'll give you one more example, and I'll not bore you after that. I'll give you one small example on the credit card side. On the credit card side, when we got into credit card space, we looked at some of these problems of credit card, and there are many of them. But one in particular is essentially the interest rates on credit card for the revolve used to be upwards of 30%. We looked at it and said, why should it be 30% if you are revolving, if at all, right? It is as good as a personal loan, not worse than that, right? We changed the game and started the credit card with a dynamic interest rate now. Our interest rate on credit card starts from 9% upwards, right? Which means on a minimum basis, you pay 9% if your credit scores are at a particular level, right? And that's what I mean. So as they say in startup space and in business space, right? An incumbent cannot be a disruptor. But we are here, I wouldn't say disrupt. We are here to innovate, solve problems, right? That's how we look at the space, right? And that's a story about IDFC FIRST Bank that I wanted to bring to you, right? I thought quickly you should know about the bank. We understand the needs of this space of emerging businesses, which comprises of startups and SMBs, right? And we understand, as I told you, the need of the ecosystem playing a role in their success, which is why the platforms like this, and I'll show you one more platform we have similar to this. All right. I'm not dwelling more on the startup ecosystem. My sense is most of you know about it. But quickly, I want to talk to you about another platform, which is for startups, emerging businesses, right? Which is called Leap to Unicorn, right? Leap to Unicorn is an attempt to help the early stage startups get knowledge and connect, which are the two key components when we looked at the space, right? Key components for their success. We've seen the mortality being high at an early stage because of these two factors. We don't want startups to die because there was nobody, they couldn't tell their stories to anybody. So this platform actually has lots of your stories in particular, right? You can look at this platform. I would urge you to go and visit this platform, look at it, right? Understand startups like you, understand businesses like you who have succeeded in their journey, right? And in the process of succeeding. So with that, thank you again. Thank you, ET Now, and thanks to all of you. Thank you again.
Let's take a quick break on that note. On the other side, we'll continue our conversations here on IDFC First Bank Presents Leaders of Tomorrow's Springboard. Welcome back. You're with us here on IDFC First Bank Presents Leaders of Tomorrow's Springboard.
Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, with whom I've had the pleasure of working as a young officer in Commerce Ministry, Mr. Sujit Bhalla, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm truly delighted to be here at the ET Now Leaders of Tomorrow Summit. India has taken over the presidency of G20 at a time when the world is going through a fairly turbulent phase. The post-COVID era has seen almost 200 million people going below the poverty line. It's seen about 100 million people losing their jobs. Almost 1/3 of the world is undergoing a recession. Almost 75 countries of the world are facing a global debt crisis. And as a consequence of the geopolitics, we are actually seeing 1 year of the Russia-Ukraine war. So Europe is badly impacted, and you have a major issue of fuel, food, and fertilizer. And in the midst of all these various crises, India's taken over the presidency of G20. Every challenge is an opportunity, and therefore, as the Prime Minister has said, that India's G20 presidency will be inclusive, it will be action-oriented, it will be decisive, and it will be outcome-oriented. G20 is important because it accounts for almost 85% of the global GDP. It accounts for almost 78% of the global trade. It accounts for almost 90% of the patents and 2/3 of the global population. It's important because the United Nations Security Council and the post-World War II Bretton Woods system that had been built up has become highly dysfunctional. It had never envisaged that one of the 5 countries which have the veto power will be at war for a protracted period of 1 year. And therefore, the consensus around which the post-Bretton Woods period had been built up has been totally impacted right now. And in many ways, actually, G20 is critical to drive acceleration of growth and many other challenges which the world is confronted with. Because you are midway through the 2030 SDG agenda, and instead of progressing, the world has actually regressed. And therefore, how do you accelerate the pace of this growth? And secondly, climate action and climate finance will be critical for the world. Though India is not responsible for carbonizing the world, and if you look at the total carbon space available at 1.5 degrees centigrade, 2,400 gigatons, India has accounted for only 1.5%, and logically, as for its population, it is entitled to 17.5%. But irrespective of that, India must aim to be the first country in the world to industrialize rapidly without carbonizing the world. It's important to do this because future valuation of companies and of countries and your ability to attract capital will be critically dependent on your ability to push for climate action. And it's important to go green because, even we realize that we are climatically blessed and we have very good young entrepreneurship, as many of you have demonstrated. And we've demonstrated our ability to achieve our NDC targets 9 years ahead of schedule. It's important to understand that actually electricity is just 20% of energy. And even if we do 100% energy, 100% of electricity as renewable, we will be only ensuring that only 20% of our energy is clean. And therefore, it's very important to focus on what is known as the hard-to-abate sectors. That is refinery, steel, cement, long-distance transport, fertilizer, many of these, which actually do not use electricity, but use fossil fuel. And therefore, it's important to decarbonize these sectors. And these sectors, if you want to decarbonize, the best and probably the only fastest way to do it is to use renewable to crack water and then use electrolyzer to produce green hydrogen. The government of India has put out the green hydrogen mission, and it's very important that we accelerate the pace of this and become, over a period of time, and it's easily possible to do this, become the cheapest cost producer, the cheapest exporter, and probably the biggest manufacturer of electrolyzer. I've been a long-term believer that India must get into sunrise areas of growth. And that's why we push the production-linked incentive scheme into areas like mobile manufacturing, like electric vehicles, battery storage, and many of these areas. Because if you look at all these countries which have grown at rapid rates of 9 to 10% over a 3-decade period, whether it was Korea, whether it was Taiwan, and much later China, they all got into new sunrise areas of growth. And if it's important that we break into these new areas, and to my mind, both the emergence of green hydrogen as a clean energy fuel, which can enable us to become totally fossil fuel-free independent by the time we achieve 100 years of our independence, 2047, is a doable proposition. This necessitates a huge push towards both renewables and our ability to decarbonize many of these sectors. To my mind, there's only one big challenge, and that challenge is, as Mr. Ahluwalia had mentioned, the world is getting increasingly protectionist. And the American IRA Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS Act are probably the most, they're the most protectionist piece of legislature ever written in the history of post-independent, post-World War II period. Secondly, as we move along, the second big issue of G20, to my mind, would be how do we use digital transformation to accelerate the pace of SDG transformation. And India's done unique work in this regard, and there's a huge Indian narrative around this. There's the big tech model of the United States of America, and if you look at the last 2 decades, it was Google, Apple, Microsoft, and Meta, which were in the forefront of all innovations, the tech innovations that took place. Every single digital innovation that took place was on account of these companies and on account of Tencent and Alibaba in China. But they ensured that citizens' data was kept with them, which they've used for artificial intelligence and machine learning. There was an alternative model of GDPR, which Europe threw up, which was about focusing on privacy, but which impacted innovation. India built up an alternative model, which was about digital public infrastructure. That is, the railway tracks. The tracks were public goods, which were owned by the government. And on top of that, we allowed private sector to innovate. So we built up digital identity for almost 1.4 billion people. Then between 2015 and 2017, we ensured that every citizen of India gets a bank account. So 480 million bank accounts were created. And actually, between that period, 55% of the bank accounts across the world were opened in India. Every second bank account opened in the world was opened in India. These bank accounts were then seeded with not merely your digital identity, but also with your mobile number. So over 1 billion Indians now have smartphones. And, we use the mobile as our bank. So I have not used my debit card or credit card for last 3.5 years. I have not been to a physical bank, and I have not been to an ATM machine. I've just used my mobile for all my transaction. And what we've demonstrated is that in the last 3 to 4 years, we've done about 11x more digital payments than what USA has done. We do 4x more payments than what China does. And this is in sharp contrast to United States, where, when I went to meet my daughter in San Francisco, the only time I've used my debit card is in San Francisco to hire an Uber vehicle. And therefore, what India has demonstrated through its digital public infrastructure, and each one of them, whether it was DigiLocker, and look at COVID, 2.2 billion people vaccinated, totally cashless, paperless, unlike anything that happened in Europe or in America. Look at the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana. When we started this seeding of the banks, only 18% of the accounts were owned by women. Today, about 78% of the women in India have bank accounts, and therefore what we've ensured is a huge amount of financial inclusion. And through the COVID period, almost 600 schemes of the government, we were putting money straight into the bank accounts of the beneficiaries. So almost 480 million people benefited during the COVID period simply because we were putting money into their bank accounts. We didn't give large packages like Europe or America gave, or any other country gave, but we ensured that the poor people get direct money into their bank accounts and there were no leakages. Digital transformation will enable us to accelerate the pace of growth in many of these countries of the South, and it will enable us to really use technology to leapfrog in many, many ways. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would merely say that going digital and going green is really the way for the future. Going digital and going green will accelerate the pace for each one of you. That will create value, that will create huge. Your ability to attract capital will come from going digital and going green. And that is the way the world will grow. And that is the fastest route for India to achieve growth. And that is the fastest way for us to achieve success during a G20 presidency. With these few words, I'll conclude. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
That's all we have time for in tonight's episode. Tomorrow's episode is in conversation with India's hottest startups, including Mama Earth, Make My Trip, and MobiKwik, talking to them about what it means to have a springboard to success like ours, but also setting the context for India's small businesses. Here's a sneak peek as we're ending tonight's show. Thanks for watching.
I do think that there are several businesses where, first mover advantage does play. But I think in our case, we were a little bit too early. So we wasted a few years bootstrapping and, working at it the hard way. And when you say, how were the early days like? The early days were just struggle. I think, founders who are starting now or in the last 5 years have no idea, because India has such an evolved angel and seed ecosystem now.